Tonight, I want to talk about America now and the need for a third Reconstruction and a revolution of moral values. I've just finished a little memoir on a movement called The Third Reconstruction, and some things are inside that book. I hope you will purchase it. Not for me, some of the money goes toward the movement, but more it's a manual for how to build some of the things I'm talking about tonight. Now, I firmly believe that when we look at what's happening on campuses, I was recently at Princeton and to do a lecture just like this, and when I got there, students had taken over the president's office to say, wait a minute, we can't keep allowing buildings to be named after Woodrow Wilson when we look at his history of how he destroyed the first Reconstruction. When I see what's happening in environmental justice, the Raise Up for 15, Black Lives Matter, Moral Monday, I don't see those movements as being separate. I see them as tributaries leading to this great river of justice that keeps rolling and rolling along. And that we are really, really in the embryonic stages, and perhaps we're actually in the birthing stage of a third Reconstruction. I believe it's right here. And I believe if we can fully grasp the power of moral fusion and sectional movement building, we can preserve the birth and prevent the abortion that some want to see come to pass. I really do believe that the third Reconstruction is right upon us. Something powerful is happening in our world and in our country. In fact, Walter Wink once said in one of his sermons, sometimes you have to thank God for an enemy, because the enemy helps to clarify what you need to be doing with the life that you have. There is this great scripture when God took the initiation to start a movement. Ezekiel wasn't thinking about a movement. The people were too depressed. They were mad, looked like they were overwhelmed. And God decided that there needed to be a reconstruction, and he asked the prophet, can these bones live? And rightfully so, the prophet said, looking at all of the forces that had been arrayed against the bones and what had left the people scattered like bones in the desert, and all of the things, economic and otherwise, that had torn the flesh off of the people and left them utterly despairing. Lord, I don't know. And then God took the initiation again and said, I tell you what, start speaking. Just start speaking. Start speaking and watch me start organizing. And then when the organization happens, watch me breathe life and see what can happen when you follow my directive. I believe it is important that we have to, if we're going to understand the moment we're in, and too many commentators are saying things like, we've never been in a political moment like this. That's a lie. We've had several moments like this in American history. And it's important to educate people on the first and second Reconstruction and make sure that we don't make the slip that Hillary Clinton made the other day when she gave the Downing version of Reconstruction that suggested it was a failure and did not give the Farner and W.E.B. Du Bois definition of Reconstruction that talks about how it was a success, it changed the nation, and then how it was undermined. The fact of the matter is, moral fusion politics that comes out of an understanding of the first and second Reconstruction provides the imagination and the mechanisms to fundamentally shift history and the socio-political trajectory of the nation. Because, as Brueggemann says, you cannot have prophetic implementation until you can engage in prophetic moral imagination. I believe that we learn lessons from the first and second Reconstruction that must be applied and utilized in this moment in history. Somebody say to somebody beside you, say, first And second, Reconstruction. You all know this is a class tonight. This is lecture. All right. Now, when I first started raising in various places, in churches and seminaries and in the street about Reconstruction language, I was fused. I was told even then by some progressive, that's too heavy for people. That's too difficult. If you raise it, people will not know what you're talking about. And I said, that's part of our problem. We have dumbed down our discussions so low. And what I understand that movement building is deeply intellectual. And that you have to be careful even when you start doing something in the movement not to think you're the first one that thought of it. And you have to be able to get all you're getting to get understanding. You cannot expect to elevate the conversation and the actions of our politics if you keep dumbing down the people's understanding of history. So let's do a little work. The first Reconstruction took place in the shadow of slavery and amid the wreckage of the Civil War. Using moral framework, many black and white preachers, African Americans and others joined hands with whites in the North and poor whites in the South who were willing to see one another as allies. Do you know that from 1868 to 1870, blacks and progressive whites in the South, not Northerners, blacks and progressive whites in the South, because there were a lot of white Southerners that didn't agree with the system of slavery, and after slavery, they found themselves as allies. And do you know by 1870, white and black alliances ended up controlling every state house in the South? And many of them were controlled by majority black in the South, South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi. And within 4 years after the end of the slavery and the Civil War, we saw this. They elected new leaders. Many of them were former slaves. Almost all of the Southern legislature were either controlled by predominantly black legislative groups or a strong fusion coalition. In fact, where I come from now in North Carolina, they had more African Americans in the state legislature in 1868 than we have today. It's a story that isn't often told. And they were voted on by white Southerners. And the first work they did was they began to hammer out a Reconstruction Constitution from a deeply moral perspective. They began to frame new constitutions that created national citizenship open to all people. In fact, the framing of North Carolina's Constitution in 1868 was heavily done by a guy by the name of J.W. Hood, who was an AME Zion minister, later became a bishop, later became president of Livingstone College, and the Grand Master of the Prince Hall Masons, and another Congregationalist, white minister. They joined together. It was that kind of leadership. It was during this period that you saw the passage of the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment in our Constitution. These fusion allies, nearly 150 years ago, they rewrote these constitutions. They built the first public schools. They made public education in state constitutions a right, a constitutional right. We don't even have that in the federal constitution today, but these Southern black and white fusion moral coalition saw education as a moral right. They extended the ballot to all men, that set the stage for it to later be extended to all women, and also put in place the possibility for Sojourner Truth and Elizabeth Canton Staton to work together in the cause of suffrage for women. For instance, in North Carolina, when those two preachers, that black preacher and white preacher and others got together and took over, this is the language in our preamble. Listen to it. This is 1868. Listen at this preamble and listen at the Constitution after Mandela in South Africa. Listen at this, 1868. We hold it to be self-evident that all persons, 1868, all persons, not men, all persons, are endowed with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, the enjoyment of the fruit of their own labor, because they knew work without the enjoyment of the fruit of your labor was nothing but pseudo-slavery. And the pursuit of happiness. That sounds like the Declaration of Independence. They took a part of the Declaration of Independence, they strengthened it, but then made it the preamble of a state constitution. In Article 11, Section 4, they wrote in 1868 in the state constitution, beneficent provision to the poor, the orphan, and the widow is the first duty of a civilized and Christian state. They knew then, black and white together, from a moral fusion perspective, that labor without living wages was not enough. So they banned it. They outlawed it constitutionally. They guaranteed equal protection under the law. Frank, I did not. When I started reading the Southern Constitution, in 1868, before the 14th Amendment was passed in 1869 and 1870, these state movements, black and white people in states, put equal protection clauses in Southern constitutions. They embraced new rules for the courts and the criminal justice system. In fact, J.W. Hood and Samuel Ashley said there were three things you had to fight for: the right to give evidence in the court, the right to sit in a jury box, and the right to put a ballot in a ballot box. He said these things under God we must have. They expanded democracy. The only time we wrote amendments in our Constitution to decrease democracy was when we passed laws like 3/5 Amendment. But every other law post-slavery was to expand democracy. But in 4 years, this moral fusion coalition faced immoral, powerful opposition. And you must understand what happened then to understand what happened now. And if you understand what happened then, you will never again say, we have not seen what we're seeing today. Many of the former Confederates saw black citizenship and black leadership working with white allies' fusion politics as inherently illegitimate. The first thing they did was they attacked white people. What are you doing working with those black people? The Klan, for instance, in North Carolina, wasn't some backroom group of people. It was formed by professors on the campus of UNC. And there's still a building on that campus named after one of them, Colonel Sanders. They formed it because they wanted to stop blacks and whites from working together, and they wanted to guarantee that black people never got an education at the University of North Carolina. They attacked then African-American leaders. They began to wail against taxes. The first call to cut taxes was in the deconstruction of the first Reconstruction, because they didn't want you to have a government that was fully funded, because then the government could not keep its promises that it had made to the slaves. So the first cry to cut taxes came in the 1870s, 1875. It was a way to undermine the government's ability to deal with what the government had helped cause, because slavery was a government policy, not a private policy. They said we got to cut taxes because if we cut taxes, the government will not be able to do the promises that were made at the end of slavery, 40 acres and a mule, for instance. They couldn't fulfill the promises of a post-slavery economy if you cut taxes. They couldn't lift up the former slavery. These extremists, these deconstructionists, they hated public schools. They did not want white and black children to be educated at the same level, so they attacked public education. They took on the ballot box. Now, they didn't undo the 15th Amendment. They said that the right to vote had to be protected by Congress, and you could not deny or abridge the right to vote. They just began to put up all kinds of impediments at African Americans to keep down fusion alliances. They worked to take over the courts. They made sure that they slowly made the courts more extreme. And after Rutherford B. Hayes' compromise, where a president who did not win by the popular vote was allowed to assume the president by a tricky electoral count. That didn't happen in 2000. This is the 1870s. And he agreed, if you elect me, I'll pull the troops out of the South and thereby allow the deconstructionists to have control of the South. And they took over the courts. And they called themselves the Redeemers. It sounds real theological. But what they meant was, we need to redeem America from the influence of black and white moral fusion alliances. They said, the Tea Party, wrong century. They said, I'm sorry, it was a slip. Wrong century. They said we have to take back our country. In 1875, we passed a law in this country, the Civil Rights Law. 1875, we passed a law that made it a felony for a business not to serve and do business with African Americans. It's called the Civil Rights Act of 1875. 100 years before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But by 1883, after taking over the courts, the Deconstructionists had slowly from the bottom taken over the court, and the first thing the courts began to do was go after the civil rights laws that had been passed through moral fusion politics. And there wasn't but one dissenter. His name was Justice Harlan out of Kentucky. Listen at them. They claim that they were rolling back voting rights, taking away criminal justice reform, because they said we've got to take America back. Does that sound familiar? Eerily familiar? And by 1898, you have a series of violent attacks where attacking and killing black men became what was seen as a necessary action. You get the Wilmington Riots of 1898, right after Plessy versus Serkin in 1896, where duly elected black and white people were run out of Wilmington on 1898, November 10th, 1898, and more people were killed, more black people were killed per capita in Wilmington, North Carolina on November 10th, 1898 than total people were killed per capita on 9/11. 3 to 5% of the city was killed in Wilmington. And they wired, after that, they wired what happened and how they did it all over the South. And the wiring, when they sent these little telegraphs, it said, the pattern for taking the country back and putting it in the proper hands of the white man. And this history wasn't even acknowledged in history books about the Wilmington riots until in the late 1990s, early year 2000. You had the Springfield riots. Then you have a president get elected, you remember his name, Woodrow Wilson, who had been the former president of Princeton University and the governor of New Jersey. And what does he do to signal the end of Reconstruction? He plays the movie Birth of a Nation in the Oval Office. Now watch this. Birth of a Nation was written by Thomas Frederick Dixon from Shelby, North Carolina. He was a Southern Baptist minister, a playwright, but he was a deconstructionist in the North Carolina legislature and a lawyer. And Dalen Roof, who killed all the folk in Mother Emanuel, when they caught him, was in Shelby, near the street that's still named after Thomas Dixon. And by the turn of the century, all the gains of the first Reconstruction had been overturned. Black voting was down to zero, fusion alliances were undone, Jim Crow and white supremacy was the law of the land. And then you go about 50 years. You got fighting going on, but it's black people by the 1900s, black men were being hung on an average a day. That's really why the NAACP started. Every morning after beginning in February 12, 1909, they hung a flag out in front of the NAACP office saying another Negro male was hung today. And by the way, the NAACP was founded by mostly white people. Jews, white people. Then you get the second Reconstruction. I'm skipping over something. 1954, blacks, whites, Latinos, young people began to come together in this era, and they built a new fusion movement with deep moral underpinnings. You get leaders like Dr. King and Jewish rabbis like Abraham Heschel, and who spoke of the urgency of moral and the moral necessity of now. The language in the street began to match the language in some pulpits. Now I have to always say that because a lot of folks say they were Dr. King, but everybody that say they were with Dr. King were really with Dr. King. So some language, this moral language. And from jail cells, they changed the language in the halls of power. Presidents and senators and congresspersons and governors, newspapers and poets began to write and talk about the moral urgency and the need for Reconstruction. Listen to Langston Hughes in that era. Oh, let America be America again, the land that never has been yet and yet must be, the land where every man is free, the land that's mine, the poor man's, Indians, Negroes, me, who made America, whose sweat and blood, whose faith and pain, whose hand at the foundry, whose plow in the rain, must bring back our mighty dream again. Remember, he was a great friend of Dr. King. Surely call me any ugly name you choose. The steel of freedom does not stain for those who live like leeches on the people's lives. We must take back our land again. America has never been America to me, but I swear this oath, America shall be. Second Reconstruction. I like to say the Second Reconstruction began with the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, when you get 9 Supreme Court justices, 1 former Ku Klux Klan member, to overturn separate but equal in a unanimous decision. It took 58 years of constant movement building post-1896. They used the dissent of Justice Harlan in both the 1883 Civil Rights case and the separate but equal case, Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. Charles Hamilton Houston used the dissent of a white man named Justice Harlan to begin to build his legal case against Jim Crow. Thurgood Marshall formed a group of Jewish and white lawyers, and in his closing arguments, you ought to read that closing argument. Thurgood thought he had lost. He said he really hadn't performed, he thought. So he decides in his closing argument not to raise just a legal argument, but to raise a moral question. He says nobody will stand in this court and urge that in order to arrive at the decision they want us to arrive at, that there would have to be some recognition of a reason why all of the multitudes of groups of this country, you have to single out Negroes and give them special treatment. The only way you can do that is that you believe there's an inherent determination that the people who were formerly in slavery, regardless of anything else, shall be kept as near the state of slavery as possible. And now is the time the courts must answer that question. That was his closing argument. Think about it. Think about what came after the Second Reconstruction, because you get the Brown decision. But then you get the next year, well, actually after the Brown decision, the first riot being discussed that was in response to Brown happened in New York. And then you get Freddie Koch, who's the daddy of Charles and David Koch, calling for the impeachment of Earl Warren. So you got to understand his history. These boys didn't just wake up and decide to be mean. They've been tutored in it. You know, just like Pat Robertson was tutored in meanness because his daddy was a senator from Virginia who came up with the phrase interposition and nullification that Dr. King used in his 1963 I Have a Dream speech. Governors whose lips are dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. Then you get the next year, Emmett Till is killed. And Rosa Parks decides, I'm not going to burn my own community down because somebody killed one of my boys. I'm going to take on the system of Jim Crow. It was Emmett Till's death and Mamie Till's decision to hold an open casket that made Mother Parks say, and Mother Parks, by the way, wasn't nonviolent. You have to read the radical Rosa Parks, by Jean Theo Harris. She wasn't some little quiet figure. She'd been investigating the rape of black women in the 1940s and the early 1950s. But when she saw Emmett Till's open casket, she made a decision, I'm going to take on Jim Crow. And if you think she sat down on the bus today and then all of a sudden 30,000 flyers showed up that they ran off with an old mimeograph machine like that, and you think it just happened overnight, I got a highway in China, I'll sell you. Huh? And then think about what happens. She sits down, King and others stand up. You get the Second Reconstruction. I'm rushing through some of this history. You get integration or desegregation of public schools. You get Medicaid, Medicare. You get the expansion of Social Security in 1954, because when Social Security was first passed, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, even though he had been pushed by Frances Perkins, a social gospeler, a woman who was in his cabinet, who said that she was there to do the work of God, he still had to cut a deal with Southern senators who said, you can pass this, but you got to make sure that African Americans, black people can't get it, and our women can't get it because they might get a little huffy. So when the first Social Security was passed, 50% of white women couldn't get it. And black people mostly couldn't get it because if you were in the agrarian community or you were in the domestic community, you could not apply for Social Security. But in 1954, that changes. And then you get the Civil Rights Act excuse me, you can go back for a second. You get, the civil rights, the Social Security, you get economic opportunity, you get the War on Poverty, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, minimum wage. Fusion politics is creating all this. It's changing the contour of politics, the landscape. It's not so much that you had new people elected, but this fusion political movement began to change the atmosphere in which those same politicians had to operate, and they could not do the things that they once were able to do. 2 years after my birth, I was born August 30 of 1963. You get the Voting Rights Act. And the language of the Voting Rights Act is clear: to enforce the provisions of the 15th Amendment. And how you get it? The Voting Rights Act was introduced after Selma created the atmosphere, the creative tension. And what happened? You get Mike Mansfield, a Democrat, and Everett Dixon, a Republican, introduced it. That's fusion politics. But this is after Bloody Sunday. And the passage of the bill increased African-American voting participation, made it possible for African-Americans to be elected once again to political offices, particularly out in the South. In 1948, only 15% of the black population was registered. By 1962, it had risen to 36%. But 1 year after the Voting Rights Act, it was 51%. And in the 1966 election, for the first time since the 1800s, a substantial number of blacks voted. In North Carolina, for instance, 281,000 voted. And that had not happened since the first Reconstruction in the 1800s. There was a moral commitment to lift the poor during the second Reconstruction. Head Start, K through 12, Pell Grants for higher education. Anybody know about these things around here? And all of these programs began to enjoy support. Russell Sage breaks the war on poverty down into three moral perspectives. The first was to boost wages through education and job training. The second was to provide income for single mothers and the elderly. And the third part was to bring a system of government health care to the elderly and the poor. But some people also failed to recognize, because this happened in the second Reconstruction, there was a race component. And that is that one of the benefits of the war on poverty was how it was linked to the Civil Rights Act. For instance, Medicaid funds were withheld from hospitals if they didn't comply with the Civil Rights Act, which in turn led to the desegregation of Southern hospitals and a drop in black infant mortality and white infant mortality rates, because by having segregated hospitals, whites in the South were hurting themselves as well. Now, you get a lot of people today to say the war on poverty didn't work. But at least then, one thing, we would use the word poor. And presidents talked about a moral vision. Didn't work. In 1960, before the war on poverty was launched, 35% of American senior citizens lived in wrenching poverty. 30% of our nation's kids. By 1975, even with all of the attempts to undermine the war on poverty, child poverty being cut in half, and poverty among seniors was reduced by 60%. But these issues weren't framed as Democrat and Republican, left and right. They were championed at the deepest level of a moral perspective, intersectional issues. Look at the old films of the people marching in the civil rights movement. You never hear them saying, "I have a dream for the Democrats." You don't hear that. I have a dream. They talked about the dream of a better nation, a moral dream, a prophetic dream. Prophetic dream. And then you begin to have a revolt against the second Reconstruction. People couldn't stand it. They turned to violence and terror. They killed Martin and Medgar and Malcolm and 4 girls in the church, and Swanner and Cheney and Goodman and Viola Luisa. And they launched the Southern strategy. And guess what the mantra of the Southern strategy was? I won't say it too loud. We must take our country back. You've heard it before, if you know history. This was again the language of the deconstructionists, and the moral imperative was removed. The progress once popular, Tim Wise says, was racialized. Programs that were benefiting black and white people were suddenly racialized. White Southern strategy, extremists, they launched a backlash and entrenchment. They attacked black leaders. They started calling once again for tax cuts. We got to cut taxes. Got a war in Vietnam. We have to cut taxes. We can't fund all these poverty programs. They went against anything that was inclusive in our democracy at the same time that we were fighting an unnecessary war in Vietnam. They called for cutting support to integrating public schools. They called for draining educational dollars into private segregated schools, and the transformative power of a moral Reconstruction movement came under attack. Now, these attacks were defined and developed by Kevin Phillips, a Nixon and Republican strategist. He called it, he named it, the White Southern Strategy. He said that the strategy was deliberately designed to play the race card, a way to drive Southern whites in the South and suburban whites in the cities and Midwestern whites to vote for so-called ultra-conservative white politics and lead the ranks of the Democratic Party that had elected persons like John Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson. And Tim Wise notes that this strategy is not new. It's been used over and over again if you understand this Reconstruction. In fact, I have to be blunt here, Lee Atwater was on tape, and he actually asked the person that was taping him, are you going to keep this tape? Or you have your tape on? And the guy said, yes. And he kept talking. And this is what Lee Atwater said. He said, you start out, this is describing the White Southern Strategy. He said, you start out in 1954 saying nigger, nigger, nigger. But by 1966, 67, 68, you can't say nigger because that'll backfire you. So you start using code words like forced busing, states' rights, law and order, immigrants are hurting us, cutting taxes. He said, you get very abstract, and these things sound totally economic, but the byproduct of them is that blacks get hurt worse than whites, and whites blame their problems on black, and those whom they are taught are getting free things for nothing. And Atwater, and you can look at the chapter in his book, he would manage later George Herbert Walker Bush, the daddy of George Bush, who ran for president in 1888, but you remember the Willie Horton campaign? That's White Southern Strategy. But it didn't start then, even way before them. George Herbert Walker Bush decided to run for the U.S. Senate, though he had never run for office. Daddy Bush, declared himself emphatic, using the language of the Southern Strategy. He opposed the Civil Rights Act of '64, not saying he was doing so because he was trying to protect white people, because it trampled on the Constitution and trampled on states' rights. He explained to the crowd in one of his speeches that the new Civil Rights Act was passed to protect 14% of the people. I'm worried about the other 84% of the people. George Wallace picked up the Southern Strategy. He didn't win, but he was the most influential loser of his time because he taught people then and now how to use the language of the Southern Strategy, the language of anti-elitism, anti-communism, and racial code words to inflame white voters reeling with fear and hatred of the Black freedom movement, the anti-war movement, the countercultural movement, and the women's liberation movement. That's what the Southern Strategy does. Now I want you to listen to something. I was listening to this guy speak the other day. Listen to him. Now I don't want you to, he says, our system is under attack. The property system, the free enterprise system, and local government. Anarchy prevails today in the streets of our large cities. The American people are not going to stand by and see the security of our nation in peril. We're going to make our nation great. And they're not going to stand by and see this nation destroyed. The liberals and the left-wingers in both parties have brought us to a domestic mess. And we're in a foreign policy mess. People are just stupid. Who is that? Who's that? George Wallace. 1968, Madison Square Garden, using the White Southern Strategy. Attacking the Second Reconstruction. He lost, but he taught Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon learned how to out-Wallace Wallace, and Richard Nixon ended up winning. And Bill Chafield, his great historian, tells us that by 1969, because of the White Southern Strategy, most middle-class whites believed that blacks had a better chance at a good education, jobs, and housing than they did, and that they did because they were getting it free. And 80% of the people said that most people on welfare could earn their own way if they wanted to. And finally, in 1973, Charles Koch picks up on this. 10 years after the March on Washington, he steals the strategy of Dr. King. While progressives were working now, by this time, on trying to find another Messiah candidate like Kennedy or Johnson, and kind of moved away from organizing and building fusion movement, Charles Koch in 1973, according to an article in the New York Times, had a meeting and he said, we're not going to invest in Messiah candidates anymore. We're going to invest in movement building from the ground up. We're going to be a moral movement from the ground up. We're going to determine what the moral categories are. We're going to fund it. We're going to create 24-hour think tanks. We're going to take over talk radio, and we're going to change the narrative. And in 1980, Ronald Reagan used this strategy to the fullest. They nominated him. Remember, he had won their hearts in 1964 when he gave his nomination speech for Barry Goldwater. That's when he won the hearts. But in 1980, he gets nominated. What does he do? What does he do? He goes to Philadelphia, Mississippi, Neshoba County, where the 3 civil rights workers have been killed. He gives a speech, and in that speech at the county fair, he uses every code word of the Southern strategy. He never says the N-word. He never says black. He talks about states' rights and voting rights and economic disaster because of entitlement. And he wins a overwhelming victory in poor counties in the South that would have been best helped by the very programs that he denounced. He won a landslide in the South. And the second Reconstruction was, for all intents and purposes, over. Now, that's a quick tale about America. It'd take me a semester to really work through it, Doctor. Maybe we'll work that out sometime. But inside of it lies a roadmap for today. We must begin to think in terms of a third Reconstruction. And I believe that that's what that we're seeing, even tonight, as we see these various movements. The demographics are changing in the South and in the country. We now know that if you register 30% of the unregistered black voters in the South and you get them to vote with progressive whites and Latinos, the South is no longer solid. And if you do that in the Midwest and you do that in other places, the same is true. We saw the birthing of this third Reconstruction with the election of President Obama. Now hold up, not President Obama as a person, the electorate that broke through in South Carolina and North Carolina and Florida and Virginia. And that's why we've had such an assault after that, because I believe those who know their history, that our adversaries, see this third Reconstruction birthing, and they're trying to snuff it out in the womb. In my book, I talk about 14 steps. I won't go through all of them, but the first thing we must start recognizing is the need for indigenously led, state-based, state government-focused, deeply moral, deeply constitutional, anti-racist, anti-poverty, pro-justice, pro-labor, transformative movement building. And there's no shortcut around this. We must build a movement from the bottom up. We must be a relationship at the state level, because that's where most of the extremism is entrenched. We're not being hurt as much from Washington as we are being hurt from governor's offices and state legislatures. And it's always been that way. Deconstruction works from the state up. It did in the first Reconstruction, it did in the second Reconstruction. And that's why you see all of this extremism in governors and state houses now, because they see the possibility of a third Reconstruction. They're working so hard to stop it. And we have to recognize that helicopter leadership by so-called national leaders will not sustain a moral movement. You must build up prophetic moral leadership in every state from the bottom up. The nation never changes from Washington, D.C. down. The nation always changes from Selma, Birmingham, Indianapolis, Greensboro up. And then secondly, we must recapture the use of moral language like the devotees of the first Reconstruction and the second Reconstruction. We must use moral language to reframe and critique public policy regardless of who's in power. You see, a moral movement claims higher ground than a partisan debate, something that's bigger. In fact, a moral movement says left and right is too puny. Democrat and Republican is too puny. Remember Coretta Scott King, when she used moral language to talk about poverty? Somebody asked her, Coretta, what do you think about violence since your husband was shot and killed? Tell us about violence. Ms. King said, but violence is more than somebody being shot. She said, poverty is a form of violence. Starving a child is a form of violence. Suppressing a culture is violence. Neglecting school children is violent. Discrimination against working people is violent. Not giving them labor rights. Ghetto housing is violent. Ignoring medical needs is violent. And then she said, even a lack of willpower to help humanity is a sick and sinister form of violence. We have to reframe the conversation and not talk about left policies and right policies. And I don't care what MSNBC and CNN, we must begin to change this narrative. And as people who run for office, we must ask them, not are you left or right, but are you on the side of violence? Or are you on the side of our deepest moral convictions, our deepest constitutional convictions? Do you believe in economic sanity or economic insanity? We need to return our public discourse to our deepest moral and constitutional values, no matter who's in power. Some things are not left or right. They are extreme. They're wrong. And we as progressive, we need to say, I always get bothered when progressives, they say, those right-wingers, those extremists, they want to read the Constitution. Read, yes. Tell them we want to read it. Don't allow them to have the Constitution. Let's read it. Let's read them in our state legislature. Let's read, and let's read in there where it talks about the establishment of justice. You want to read the Constitution? Let's read about providing for the common defense. In fact, let's read the Constitution so we can use welfare again in the public square. Since welfare is in the Constitution, promoting the general welfare. There is really in our Constitution no license for capitalism unless it's human rights capitalism. There's really no notion in our Constitution of freedom unless it's the freedom that establishes justice. We have to take back the language. Somebody say, take back the language. I don't have time to work through it, but J. Cameron Carter talks about how language is either the tool of incarceration or the tool of liberation. He said whenever groups conquered nations, the first thing they did was made their language second class. Because once you make their language second class, you can make their body second class, you can make their community second class. So we got to take back. Why did we allow them to take welfare? Why do we still allow? Why are we allowing them to use language like left versus right that comes out of the French Revolution when the right wanted the monarchy and the left didn't want it? Don't allow folk to put you in boxes. For God's sake, why are we calling people right that we think are so wrong? Why do we create a linguistic trap for ourselves? Moral language, however, gives us new metaphors. You can say, I'm against this policy not because it's a conservative policy or a liberal policy. I'm against it because it's constitutionally inconsistent, morally indefensible, and economically insane. And then we have to challenge the moral hypocrisy of the so-called religious right. First of all, as I said, we got to stop calling them that. And we just have to call what they're doing what it is, theological heresy. I told them today, I'm a theological biblicist. I'm a conservative. The greatest sin in the Bible is the sin of idolatry, self-worship. And the second greatest sin in the Bible is wherever there's self-worship, there's injustice toward other people, because you can't allow other selves to be if yourself is all that matters. And there are more than 2,000 scriptures in the Bible that deal with the issue of injustice toward women, the stranger, and the poor. Isaiah 10, woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights. When the last time we talked about the rights of the poor in the public square? Luke 4:18, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to poor. The Greek word there for poor is patokos, which means those who have been made poor by exploitation. Matthew 25, tell the nations when I was hungry. It doesn't say tell the individual. That's not a scripture about individual charity. Tell the nations, ask the nations when I was hungry. Did you feed me? So we can't succumb to those who bought Christianity. I know you all are reading the book up here. I just know One Nation Under God. If you're not, every professor ought to be signing it. It's the story of how the deconstructionists bought the American pulpit after the New Deal. They literally bought it because they did a poll and they found out they didn't like what Franklin Delano Roosevelt had done and Francis Perkins had done, the great social gospelist. So what they said was, we got to change the narrative, but we don't have the popularity. They were low in the poll, but they said, but preachers are high in the poll, but they're not preaching what we want them to preach, because the social gospelers, they were all over the place. They had lifted up this Walter Rauschenbusch books and Washington Glenn, what would Jesus do, was not just a little thing you wore around your wrist. It was a question that you asked in the face of child poverty, in the face of 80-hour work weeks. And so they bought Christianity. And in the book, One Nation Under God, it talks about how they actually hired a guy out of Los Angeles to debone the gospel, take all the stuff of justice out. Then they funded him, and then they would get together and do practice sermons to find out which sermons were the best. And then the argument was, if you do good, you go to heaven. So if you do good, you're rich. If you do bad, you go to hell. So if you do bad, if you're poor, you must be doing bad. And by 1945, they had 15,000 preachers preaching these sermons. And they bought pulpits and bought seminaries. And they either wanted you to be one or two things. They either wanted you to preach this strange political philosophy or just be apolitical. In other words, just have a little worship. There would have been no labor movement without a social gospel underpinning, a moral underpinning. There would have been no abolitionist movement without a moral underpinning. There would have been no civil rights movement without a moral framework. We must recapture moral language, and progressives, for some reason, ran away from it. Almost as though it was a disease. And sometimes even today when we see somebody like Franklin Graham up on the TV and he's saying, then they'll put an atheist counter him. No, call Frank Thomas. We ought to start demanding that. Call somebody that knows the tradition, that walks in the tradition, that can say to Franklin, wait a minute, I'm an evangelical. I'm a conservative. I don't know what you're talking about. Then we need a moral agenda. Say moral agenda. Yeah, we need a moral agenda. And I believe the moral agenda should be this. Number one, we want to secure pro-labor, anti-poverty, anti-racist policies that ensure economic sustainability by fighting for full employment, living wages, the alleviation of disparate unemployment, a green economy, labor rights, affordable housing, targeted empowerment zones, addressing bad trade deals that hurt poor here and the poor around the world, strong safety nets for the poor, fair policies for immigrants, infrastructure development, ceasing war baiting and extreme militarism, and fair tax reform. Then we should have educational equality, that every child should receive a high-quality, well-funded, constitutional, diverse public education, access to community college or university. Third, we should want health care for all, beginning with the Affordable Care Act, but eventually just as everybody having health care like in South Africa, like in Canada, like in every other major country around the world. We should defend Social Security, we should defend Medicare, we should protect women's health, and environmental justice should be at the center of a moral agenda, because they may have found water on Mars, but we are still stuck down here. And then we should fight for fairness in the criminal justice system by addressing the continuing inequalities in that system. Not only that affect black people, but we need to connect the injustices of black people, brown people, and poor white people. And then finally, we should provide for equal protection under the law. We should protect and expand voting rights, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, immigrants' rights, and never give up on the fundamental principle of equal protection under the law. And then that should be the agenda, so we can start moving into some meetings and not keep having the meeting about what the agenda ought to be. We need to start having meetings about how we build action on the agenda. And these things are not illogical, and they don't cost too much. And it's not Bernie Sanders' idea. I got them from Jesus. I got them from the prophets. And then we have to build a stage for this agenda that lifts up the voices of everyday people. The genius of Moral Monday is when people come to the stage, they are the people impacted by the policy, not somebody speaking on their behalf, but building a stage not to help the poor, but to work with the poor, and they speak for themselves. A moral Reconstruction movement puts a face on injustices, making sure that people have a platform. And then we must recognize the centrality of race. Racism is America's original sin. And when somebody says to you, is it race or is it class, you need to simply say, it is. That's your answer. You can never separate the two. Our class divisions can't be understood apart from a society built on white supremacy. And there's a difference now between talking about white people versus white supremacy. That's why white people can talk about white supremacy, because white supremacy doesn't mean all white people. It simply means the white people that only want white people to have stuff. Just like black supremacy would be black people that want only black people to have stuff. Yeah. Today, and the reason you got to clarify that, because today you even have some black people promoting policies that actually fuel and undergird white supremacy. Like my good friend Senator Tim Scott out of South Carolina, who just last night said, I endorse Marco Rubio. I was saying, that's cool. I was saying, okay, you got your right to. Then he said this. He said, well, what, Marco Rubio was his first-time senator, Barack Obama was the first-time senator, and his answer, black as he is, well, I am totally against President Obama. He said, huh? Yeah, he said, I'm totally against President Obama. Then he said, because he's a divider. And he hasn't done anything. And if you elect Marco Rubio, he will be 180 degrees different than President Obama. So I said, maybe if other folk didn't understand what you meant, but that means we'll go to war. That means we'll push immigrants out. That means we'll let the sick die. That means we won't raise the minimum wage. Tim Scott, are you crazy as poor as South Carolina is? So you cannot, racism is so entrenched that it has actually gotten some of us promoting the very thing that has destroyed people for years. So the critique has to be anti-racist and anti-poverty, no matter what the face looks like when a policy is put forward. And that's the difference between a moral movement and a black movement. Because it's not just about black or white, it's about a moral movement. Glenn Lowry talks about how we got now this strange disease called racism without racists. He says, but if you look in every area, unemployment, wealth levels, all of the observable measures, the only way you can ignore systemic racism is you just close your eyes. And he says not only that, if you only the will for death cannot hear the dog whistle politics of race. For instance, when you call the president a food stamp, a juvenile, unfit, a lie, not a liar. Remember the guy in South Carolina? He said, you a lie. He didn't say he was a liar. That's a different statement. You are a lie. Your very existence is a lie. You're not, you're something else. You're an anomaly. Huh? Or the other night when somebody said, you're just a child. Those are the new terms for the N-word. Huh? Yeah. Lana Grenier says that racial disparity is still the canary in the minds of America. And so we can't have a truly a new South or a new country until we have a grown-up reality check and a diagnostic exam about the power of the reincarnated vestiges of the white Southern strategy and how it has such a lock on so much of our political consciousness, and the media and nobody else is calling it out. Only a moral movement can do that. We must help people face this question. What is it that causes many whites that are poor, since the census say 18.9 million whites are poor, which is 8 million more poor white people than black and 5 million more than Latino, what causes many whites, particularly out in the South and the Midwest, and to fight, be against programs like food stamps and Medicaid when mostly whites are using them? What is it? What myth causes you to be against living wages when most of the people that are working poor are white? What causes you to elect politicians that represent the poorest counties in the north, south, east, and west? But the people who are elected to represent those counties that you vote in, vote against programs that would help people in those counties. We need a grown-up conversation about race and class. What is it? What is it in the South where you have the most uninsured people and the most states denying Medicaid expansion? What is it that made your governor work so hard not to get Medicaid expanded? What is it that just today on the news, your governor was asked about the civil rights bill, the LGBT, and his answer was, I'm going to focus on economics. Doesn't he know that's what people said during slavery? Yeah, we're not going to worry about the slave being free and the immorality of that. Slavery's making us money. I don't want to worry about. Maybe he doesn't know. What makes you stand against programs that helps rural hospitals be saved and serves construction workers and healthcare workers, and most of those people are white? What makes you fight against it? What makes a person like Ted Cruz, who has Latino background, fight against Obamacare while at the same time he's on it? And the people can't pick, and the people in the electorate can't get that. What myth makes you think that privatizing schools with public money is the way to go? What myth? What myth? What is so powerful that it can make you vote against your own self-interest? We have to raise that in our pulpits and in the public square. And then we must have a movement that focuses on voting. The only way I can say this is everybody ought to be deeply concerned that we have less voting rights 50 years after Selma than we did. I mean, that ought to just disturb you. That's like somebody going into your grandmama's, at the place where your grandma was buried and digging up her casket and throwing the bones all out and just stomping on them. It's just desecration. The Congress has sat on fixing the Voting Rights Act for 2 years. That means Strom Thurmond only filibustered the Civil Rights Act for 2 days. We've been filibustering fixing the Voting Rights Act for 2 years. And you must understand that an attack on voting rights is not just a black issue. When you attack on voting rights, it's an attack on women, it's an attack on public education, it's an attack on black lives, it's an attack on labor rights, because the people you elect affect all of the policies we are concerned about. And then, lastly, if we want this third Reconstruction, we must have a commitment to strategic civil disobedience. Not civil disobedience where nobody really knows why you mad, but strategic civil disobedience, where the messaging is clear, where the face is broad and diverse, and that's consistent, that's not about a one-moment mentality, but about building a movement that understands that if the same people fighting public education are the same people fighting Medicaid expansion, are the same people fighting women's health, are the same people fighting the LGBT community, are the same people fighting labor rights and living wage, if they are cynical enough to be together, we ought to be courageous and moral and smart enough to come together, not for one rally. And my friends, I'm telling you, what you saw on the tape earlier, what you saw on that tape is real. It can happen. In fact, I don't know if Alan Bozak is here tonight, but in South Africa, they used to have a phrase, only a dying mule kicks the hardest. And that's why you gotta have a moral movement that knows how to walk by faith, that knows how to understand victory at the cross. That understands that if extremists, the deconstructionists of this era, are working this hard, we must be bad. They must see something. They wouldn't be working this hard, taking over the Supreme Court, taking voting rights, hitting everybody. They would not be doing it. And sometimes your enemy is the proof of your strength. And so, my friends, it's our time to believe that the wealthy can pay their fair share. We can have a living wage. We can have workers' rights. We can stop giving socialism to corporations, free money for bailouts. We can give capitalism to students by charging them, and then turn around and give capitalism to students by charging them interest on money. It doesn't have to be like this. We can address the ugly realities of racism and poverty, and they know it. That's why they're fighting so hard. The sick can have health care. The environment can be protected. We can do this. We've seen it in North Carolina. When we started the Moral Monday movement, every issue, Frank, every issue we were fighting for was under 50%. Every one of them. In the polls, over 50% of North Carolina. But after a consistent year of civil disobedience and messaging and standing together, the governor, who was at 50% in the poll, is now at 35%. The legislature, that was at 40%, is now at 19%. And every issue that we stood for is now polling over 50% in favor. Now that didn't happen overnight. It took 1,000 people getting arrested. It took black, white, and Jews, and Muslims, and Christians, and even some non-believers, and gay people, and straight people, and Republicans and Democrats holding hands. It took organizing 1,000 clergy in 8 or 9, 10 different faiths coming together and writing our own lexicon, if you will, writing our own thesaurus, writing our own theological framework for why we were engaged. It took 120 Moral Monday activities. But what I've learned is that it works. But you gotta work it. You gotta work while it's day. You gotta believe that things can still change. You can't just quote scripture because it's cute and required in church. At some point you gotta believe it. You gotta believe that the stones that the builders rejected can become the chief cornerstone. You've got to believe that God said, speak to those bones. God knows what he's talking about. Even if you don't understand the outcome, speak to the bones. When we started, we only had 16 organizations. Now we have 200. Speak to the bones. When we started, 1,000 people had arrest records. But 2 or 3 months ago, the judge threw out all of the arrest records and changed the rules in the legislature and said they can't arrest us anymore. Speak to the bones. Speak to the bones. When we started, we didn't have one lawyer. I didn't tell them that. When we first went to jail, we didn't have bail Monday. I didn't tell them that. You know, some things you keep is called messianic secret. But by the end of the movement, we had 120 free lawyers. When they started the attack on voting rights, we did not have the Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act to ensure pre-clearance. We didn't know where our law firm was coming from. We didn't have $3 million to mount a campaign in the courts against the worst voter suppression law in the country. But we were in the street. We got a call from Washington, D.C., from a prominent law firm. When you're at their office, you can look right across at the White House. They said, we heard there's a movement, and we've been itching for a fight. I said, how much it cost? They said, nothing. We coming and we're bringing our whole law firm. And then the Advancement Project came and they brought their whole law firm. And just the other day when we gave closing arguments, on their side was 4 old white men just sitting over there. On our side was an Asian lawyer and a Latino lawyer and a Jewish lawyer and a black lawyer and a white lawyer. In fact, it was 30 lawyers. Speak to those bones. Speak to those bones. And if you speak to them, I'll put the LGBT community together with the civil rights community. I'll put the civil rights community together with the educational advocates. I'll put the educational advocates together with the environmental advocates. I'll put the environmental advocates together with the peace advocates. I'll put the peace advocates together with the healthcare advocates. I'll put the healthcare advocates together with the criminal justice advocates. I'll put the criminal justice advocates together with Black Lives Matter. Then I'll reach back and get the retired SNCC folk, get them a little strength, let them come back for one more term. Then I'll get some Republicans and some Democrats and some Libertarians, and I'll put all of them together, and I'll shake it up, and then I'll blow some wind on them, and they will not be Democrats. They will not be Republicans. They will be a mighty army standing up in the valley, ready for a third Reconstruction. It is possible. It is possible. It is possible. If you know where we're being, like the Sankofa bird, you can look backwards and fly forward. And fact of the matter, you ought to tell your neighbor, ain't nobody scared of a tea party. Ain't nobody scared because somebody been sniffing coke, K-O-C-H. We've been through slavery. We've been through Jim Crow. We've seen women without the right to vote. And if they won, if Harriet Tubman could get 500 slaves out of slavery, and she didn't have Twitter, she didn't have Google, she didn't have email, all she had was a mind stayed on the Lord, moss on the north side of the tree, a North Star in the sky, a .38 pistol if you wanted to go back and she was going to send you to heaven, and some white abolitionists. But when they all got together, I didn't tell you this history for you to say, oh God, the same thing. I told you this history because we won. We won. Every time we came together and built a moral fusion framework, we won. And the odds were actually greater then than they are now. Get your hope together. Stop looking at the valleys in the bone and start listening to God. And speak. Amen. And organize. Get out of these pulpits. Come on. And get in the street and in the pulpit. Turn these seminaries loose to train people in public theology. Snatch back the language. Get our best scholars hooked up with our best activists. And let's build a moral movement that would challenge Democrats, challenge Republicans, but more important, will push to full birth a third Reconstruction. And let's just see, as they say down home, what the Lord might do. Yes.